All right, for today's episode, we're going to go over the sleeping prophet, Edgar Cayce, against the creator of the Urantia papers, well, at least some of them, the sleeping subject. Isn't it ironic that there were two major publicized works surrounding celestial or universe knowledge in the early 20th century? But yet, neither Edgar Cayce nor the creators of the Urantia papers ever mentioned one another in their work. I'm curious as to whether this reality either refutes or validates each other's works. I mean, after all, especially Edgar Cayce, they were most certainly one of the few spiritual leaders of that time. As a quick self-disclosure of my own biases, I am a large fan of the overall message Cayce was trying to present and agree with many of his concepts of God and the interconnectedness of the universe. This is, of course, in line with the first source and center of the Urantia Book. I will also remind viewers, without discrediting either source of today's discussion, that even fables or myths can spur substantial spiritual significance. In today's video, we will discuss the similarities and differences between these two sources in a way that's easy to understand and digest. We will discuss who Edgar Cayce was, what the Urantia Book says, and how they potentially overlap per Edgar Cayce and the Urantia Book by John Bunker and Karen Pressler, how they clash, and why people still wonder whether Cayce had anything to do with the creation of the Urantia Book. All right, so let's get started examining whether Edgar Cayce was not the sleeping prophet, but the sleeping subject of the Urantia Book. We start off today by imagining two very different ways of learning about God, the universe, and the meaning of life. One comes from a man named Edgar Cayce, who became popular in the early 1900s and was most known for giving readings while in a trance state. Originating from Kentucky, Edgar turned to religion early on in his life, starting around the age of 10, as he read the Bible very frequently. After 1889, during his first significant childhood event of a winged woman appearing before him that promised to answer his prayers. During the 20th century, people would ask him questions about health, spirituality, or even history, and Edgar would answer in ways that often amazed the people around him. His later works were brilliantly documented and categorized, adding to the legitimacy of his believers. The other published works comes from a giant book called the Urantia Book, published in 1955, which claims to be written by celestial beings. The Urantia papers circumnavigate realities that the meaning behind life is not about one person's life, reinforcing that it's about the entire universe, God's plan, and the story of Jesus told in a new way as one large cosmic family. This cosmic family welcomes each individual to an eternity of service, as long as the individual ultimately wishes to have a relationship with God and strive for their own individualistic view of perfection. At first glance, these two sources might seem like they belong to totally different worlds. Cayce was a human being who gave personal advice, while the Urantia Book is a mysterious text that hides its human connections and says that it came from higher celestial beings. But when you look closer, you find that they share some ideas, especially about prayer, service, and even Jesus, that begins forming bridges. At the same time, they tend to disagree strongly about other things, such as reincarnation, Atlantis, astrology, and how the afterlife actually works. Edgar Cayce was born in 1877 in Kentucky. He grew up in a Christian family and loved the Bible. As a young man, he discovered that he had a strange ability. When he went into a deep sleep, a trance-like sleep, he would answer questions about health, life, and even spiritual matters. People started calling him the sleeping prophet. Cayce gave thousands of readings during his lifetime. Many were about health. He would suggest diets, exercises, or remedies that often help people feel better. So as a brief side note here is a code coin that Edgar Cayce created. All it is carbon steel. Maybe some of you can guess what this was used for, hence the name, right? To prevent colds. Which was meant to be placed as close to your groin as humanly possible. And for most people that don't go to the extreme here, will just simply place it in their pocket. As another fascinating example, he was able to cure his wife's tuberculosis after following a treatment prescribed by one of his psychic readings, which involved inhaling the fumes of apple brandy from a charred oak barrel. Other readings that Cayce performed were about spiritual growth, past lives, or the meaning of dreams. He believed that prayer and meditation were powerful tools for connecting with God. He also believed in reincarnation, the idea that people lived many lives on Earth to learn and grow spiritually. Cayce wasn't trying to start a new religion. He wanted to help people better their lives. His followers later created the Association for Research and Enlightenment, the ARE, which still exists today and studies his readings. Albeit he did claim in a previous life to be an Egyptian priest, named Ra-Ta, in a previous life. Many of Edgar Cayce's interventions were practical and helpful to his patrons. Now let's jump to the Urantia Book. This massive book was published in 1955 in Chicago. It's over 2,000 pages long and divided into 4 parts. It claims to be written by celestial beings, angels, celestial administrators, and other spiritual personalities who wanted to give humanity a new revelation. The book covers a lot of ground. It explains the structure of the universe with countless worlds, universes, and levels of reality. It talks about God as the universal Father, the source of all creation. It describes spiritual beings, the journey of the soul after death, and the meaning of life. The last part of the book retells the life and teachings of Jesus in great detail, adding stories and teachings not found in the Bible. One of the most intriguing mysteries surrounding the Urantia Book is its origin. The human authors were kept a secret. The Urantia Foundation, who published the text, indicate that the book was delivered through a special process involving a contact personality, but they omit such a person's identity. The logic surrounding this decision was that the focus should be on the message and not the messenger. This premise seems to be in line with the belief from the Urantia Book that no saint or intermediary should come between you and God. So why do people compare Edgar Cayce to the Urantia Book in the first place? For one thing, they both appeared in America during the first half of the 20th century, a time when many people were exploring new spiritual ideas. Cayce was giving readings from the early 1900s until his death in 1945, which would be in line with the 1911 to 1935 timeline surrounding the creation of the Urantia Papers. If taken at face value and as presented, the Urantia Book was eventually published just 20 years later, in 1955, which was roughly 10 years after Edgar Cayce's death, in 1945. Some researchers have even questioned whether or not Edgar Cayce had an influence on the Urantia Book, since the book's human authors remain hidden. It's possible to imagine that Cayce, or people close to him, could have played a pivotal role. There's even an argument that the aforementioned book named Edgar Cayce and the Urantia Book claims to explore. That's one of several arguments that the aforementioned book named Edgar Cayce and the Urantia Book attempts to explore. But even if there was a connection, the teachings of Cayce and the Urantia Book don't exactly line up perfectly, and likely do not have the same origin source. They share some values, but they also disagree on some larger issues. That's what makes the comparison so intriguing for believers of the Urantia Book. Let's start with the similarities, because they both showed Cayce and the Urantia Papers caring about how people grew closer to God. Prayer and meditation are both something Cayce and, of course, the Urantia Papers seem to support. Cayce often told people to pray and meditate to connect with God and find healing. The Urantia Book describes prayer as a way to align yourself with God's will and grow spiritually. The Urantia Book focuses more on simply having a conversation with God, while Cayce indicated that prayer was communicating with God and that meditation was actually listening to God. In both cases, prayer isn't just about asking for things. It's about building a relationship with your Heavenly Father. As for Jesus, both Cayce and the Urantia Book focuses on Jesus as being the most important figure in human history. Cayce's readings often discuss Jesus' life and, of course, teachings. The Urantia Book devotes its entire fourth section to retelling Jesus' life in great detail, presenting him as a perfect example of how all humans should live. Service and love were both traditions cherished, indicating that spirituality shows up in kindness, service, and love. Cayce's readings often encourage people to be generous, forgiving, and helpful. The Urantia Book says that the soul grows through acts of love and loyalty, guided by the inner presence of God via a thought adjuster and other divine agents. Now, focusing on the differences, which of course I want to reinforce that I am not claiming to be an expert on Edgar Cayce, will point out of what I see to be a superficial face value statement here. The first being reincarnation, that Cayce very much believed in. He said people live many lives on Earth to learn lessons and to grow spiritually. The Urantia Book rejects reincarnation completely, except with extremely rare special service assignments. It says that each person generally lives just one life on Earth, and after death, the soul moves on to higher spiritual worlds in Urantia form. This contrast is probably the biggest difference between these two sources. In addition, Edgar would go into a sleep-like state and answer questions and would be completely fatigued by the end of such an engagement. The Urantia Book presents itself as a finished text written by celestial beings that used a sleeping subject, rather than prophet, in some mysterious way. Outside sources seem to speculate that the sleeping subject received such an ability from an experienced thought adjuster, likely suggesting that the subject possibly did not feel depleted after their sessions, since the messages were not really coming from them directly. The messages from the subject did not come through personal readings. It comes as a giant, organized book in written form, versus any form of dictation that is known to us. Contrastingly, Cayce was very open about the type of person that he was. Everyone knew his name, his life story, and his work, which was well documented and categorized in his later years. The Urantia Book hides its human connections, which are some of its major shortcomings. The people who published it did not clearly articulate how the process was done, saying the focus should be on the message itself rather than on the messenger. The last section, known as the life and teachings of Jesus, was indicated to completely bypass the sleeping subject entirely, simply materializing by itself in 1935. While the focus of Cayce's work often focused on health, healing, and personal guidance, the Urantia Book focuses on explaining the universe, God's plan, and the soul's journey. Like stated previously, Edgar Cayce's followers created the ARE, which studies his readings and promotes holistic health and spirituality. They hold conferences, publish books, and encourage people to practice prayer and meditation. The Urantia Book has its own fellowship, with study groups around the world that are either independent or connected through the Urantia Foundation. Readers gather to discuss the book's teachings, especially its cosmology and its portrayal of Jesus. Both communities are dedicated to spiritual growth, but yet they still have differing styles. Cayce's community is more practical and health-focused, while the Urantia Book community is more intellectual and cosmological. Comparing Edgar Cayce to the Urantia Book helps a reader compare two different ways of approaching spirituality. Cayce shows how one person's gift can touch thousands of lives through personal readings and practical advice. The Urantia Book shows how a mysterious text can inspire people with a grand vision of the universe and God's plan. They both align in sharing values like prayer, service, and devotion to Jesus. But they disagree on reincarnation, the afterlife, and how spiritual knowledge is delineated. Some people think Cayce might have been connected to the Urantia Book in some way. Others say the book's anonymity means that we will never know. After all, if we assume there was both a sleeping prophet and a sleeping subject, then suffice it to say that each was the mouthpiece for another entity or force other than ourselves, which throws patterns and belief systems right out the proverbial window, since its authors may vary. As a side note here, it does appear as though Edgar Cayce was at one time in the Chicago area, citing a few days stretch in March of 1925 that had to do with a newspaper called the Chicago Examiner. However, there is no expansive amount of time in which Cayce would have been able to directly participate in the creation of the Urantia papers during such a time. When it comes to the Wilfred Kellogg connection, oftentimes, even its stronger evidence majorly connected by Martin Gardner, writings that can be found in the Skeptical Inquirer, presents strong evidence that he deduced from the Urantia Brotherhood intimates that told him that the sleeping subject was in fact Wilfred Kellogg, who was the nephew of the founder of the Kellogg Cereal Company, brother-in-law to William Sadler, who spearheaded the Urantia Book, and being also a previous member of the Seventh-day Adventist group. So this Adventist connection is really important to understand since it highlights the key similarities between the Urantia Book and the Seventh-day Adventist group, which includes believing that the Archangel Michael was also Jesus Christ, just like in the Urantia Book. In addition, the concepts of soul sleep and soul annihilation are mirrored in the Adventist belief structure as well when comparing the texts. Wilfred Kellogg was also the alleged founder of the Contact Commission in the early days of formulating the text and bears his name on many pieces of legal documentation associated with publishing the Urantia papers. However, linking Wilfred to being a hard-boiled businessman of the Chicago Stock Exchange has been difficult to research. Either way, the comparison invites us to think about how humans search for truth and how different paths can lead to similar values, even when details don't necessarily match. In the end, Edgar Cayce and the Urantia Book are like two different roads leading toward the same mountain. Cayce's road is personal, practical, and focuses on healing. The Urantia Book's road is cosmic, structured, and focused on explaining the universe. Both roads encourage prayer, service, and love. Both honor Jesus as the greatest example of how to live. But the roads don't overlap completely. Cayce's road includes reincarnation. The Urantia Book's does not. Cayce's road is open about its author's well-documented spiritual journey. The Urantia Book's road hides its human connection, and even admits attempts towards explaining its origins will leave more questions than answers. Thank you again for watching today's video, your continued support, and I'll see you on the next one. All right, everybody, so just real quick, I want to show some of the viewers some of the horrible bloopers that we have when it comes to me trying to produce a lot of these films. So as you can see in this one, the age difference was just far too great trying to present the divine consort. And in this one, this person was supposed to be receiving divine assistance, and that one got botched throughout the making as well. This one was supposed to be a map of the Middle East during the times of Jesus in the 1st century, and as you can see, it's kind of useless. And the upcoming video is supposed to be angelic support, right? Which is kind of true in this video, but we need more than just an arm and a hand, right? And it's kind of creepy, which is why I try not to use that clip too often. So much when it comes to a soul forge, when it comes to this video, it looks like a giant marshmallow being formed. Kind of funny if you think about it. All right, and this one, of course, is the Urantia Book, but of course, it looks like there's actually 2 copies of the text, right? There's no book binding, which is kind of strange. This one looks like Jesus is doing some heavy lifting, but when it comes to the size of the pole, of course, that wasn't how the crucifixion actually happened, and of course, Jesus had his right arm.
So?
Okay, and this one's supposed to be a woman trying to calm down two men. It didn't come out the way that I wanted, and of course, when it comes to clean AI, they have a preference for Asian cultures. This one was supposed to be Jesus being a carpenter, which, of course, the wood and the hammer are there, but we need some nails, and he actually has to be working on something, right? Preferably a boat. Okay, and this one is supposed to be a woman shopping at a grocery store and being surprised by seeing Jesus that's offering the water of life. But as you can see, somebody just places a water bottle beneath a cart, a shopping cart. This one here I've actually used before in other videos. I do like its orientation. I don't like the fact that Jesus is making a mess of the wine. And this one just looks like Jesus has had a really bad day, right? He looks distressed, a little anxious, which is why I really can't use this video to portray what I feel Jesus would look like. And as you can see in this video, the boat that the guy's in is slowly sinking. I'm sure the fish are happy, right? Still being in water, but naturally that would not be occurring. And in this final video, this is a woman that's supposed to be toxic and lying about being sick. And of course, the video didn't even come close to representing that. All right, well, hopefully you guys enjoyed some of these bloopers,
Change Talk
and I'll see
LLC.
you on the next video.